Please, if you have any questions or any comments, break in at any time. A question: how barbarous were the barbarians? There is a popular impression of the barbarians, and I keep using the phrase savages with tattooed faces and butter smeared in their hair. That does describe the barbarians during the 3rd century break-ins, when the Goths broke across the Danube or bypassed it and came to the Black Sea. They came to destroy. They were terrifying people. Although the barbarians who entered the empire from the end of the 4th century onwards were not always peaceful settlers, and they were often rather violent, dangerous people to have as neighbours, they were not savages. Rather than looking at them as the people who broke in and destroyed, we should see them as the people who came to join, and often to serve, and sometimes to preserve, and whose contribution to late antiquity was often decidedly positive. If you look at what Theodoric did in Italy, we discussed that last week. If you look at the buildings he commissioned, if you look at his method of government, you do not see howling barbarians bringing disaster to their unfortunate subjects. With very few exceptions, the barbarians who came into the territory of the Roman Empire were a surprisingly creative and capable and intelligent set of peoples. I suppose one reason we should bear this in mind is that in many cases these are our actual ancestors. But even leaving such considerations aside, the barbarians did not have an entirely negative effect on the world of late antiquity. Question: how literate were the barbarians? The question of literacy in antiquity is a live one at the moment. There is a book, E.V. Harrison, Ancient Literacy, which makes a very compelling case for the proposition that literacy as we understand it was confined to not more than 5% of any Greek or Roman population at any time in antiquity. The number of people who could read and write in the ancient world was vanishingly small. It was about as big as it was in Europe before about 1350. Since about 1350, literacy has steadily expanded in Europe out of all comparison with ancient models. And there's a number of reasons for supposing that literacy was limited. The first is that writing materials were tremendously expensive. A single sheet of papyrus, about 10 inches by 18 inches, let's say, would have cost about a day's wages of an ordinary person. Let's say about £100 for a single sheet of papyrus. It was a rather stiff, uncomfortable medium for writing. It's rather like writing on anaglypta wallpaper. It can be done, but it's not as easy as writing on A4 bought pre-lined from W.H. Smith, is it? Another consideration is that there were no spectacles in those days, and once you get past a certain age, or in my case, once you get to the age of 8, you'll find that reading is not quite so easy without some kind of support. You also have the fact that after about 200 BC in the Greek-speaking world, and after about 50 AD, 100 AD in the Latin-speaking world, the language in which books were published was not very easy for most people to understand. All of these considerations added up together make for very limited literacy. When you ask, were the barbarians terribly literate? They were no more literate than the Greeks and the Romans, possibly no less. Something where Harrison, I think, is not very good is his discussion of the effect of Christianity on literacy. Christianity is peculiarly a religion of the book, and the ability to read that book and the ability to read what has been written around that book is a great deal more important than reading and writing were among the pagans. But yes, the barbarians were broadly literate in the same way as the Greeks and Romans, yes. A question about the general capacity of the barbarians. A fact we often overlook is that many of the barbarian leaders who came across the Rhine in 406, or many of the barbarians who came across the Danube in 378, had military experience in the Roman army. And there appears never to have been any serious difficulty between Romans and barbarians when it came to communicating. You do not often read about interpreters. Therefore, it does seem that many Romans were able to speak some of the Germanic dialects, and it seems reasonable to suppose that many of the barbarians were fluent in spoken Latin. That's not the same as the classical Latin that we study, but they were able to communicate in spoken Latin and indeed in spoken Greek. I will draw attention later on today to a number of sources which suggest that in their appearance, Greeks, Romans and barbarians were indistinguishable. It was not a question of them and us. Now, without making any kind of judgments, one way or the other, when the Muslims broke into the Eastern Empire and took away Egypt and Syria, and this is not an absolutist statement because there was a period in which the two civilizations do blur into each other to some degree, but what the Arabs brought into the Levant after the 630s was a new civilization which replaced the classical Christian civilization in large degree, once you leave aside the fact the Arabs generally left the Christian populations alone and they dwindled away only after the Crusades. But what the Arabs brought in was a new civilization and a displacing civilization. The Huns, like the Mongols later on, destroyed, and they didn't create anything. Whereas the Germanic barbarians invaded, they largely assimilated themselves and they contributed. Although at the moment we're focusing on the early days of the barbarian invasions, once you move into the 7th and 8th centuries, you find a number of very distinguished, indeed brilliant, historians, philosophers, poets, theologians, you name it, and they're all of barbarian origin. Bede, the Englishman, possibly the greatest Latin writer of the Middle Ages, a man of immense and sometimes inexplicable learning. And he was barbarian through and through. If you wanted to find a drop of Roman blood in his veins, you would need to look very hard through the microscopes. Or Alcuin of York, who was the head of Charlemagne's educational outreach. He was an Englishman, or he was a barbarian. Or Paul the Deacon, not the greatest writer of Latin in the Middle Ages, but probably one of the 2 or 3 most entertaining, and certainly my personal favourite. He was a barbarian who was proud of his Lombard ancestry. Or Liutprand of Cremona, towards the end of our period, perhaps outside our period, 900 AD. He was also a writer of great distinction. And Duns Scotus, an Irishman who, again, was a barbarian. But once you get past about 700 AD, unless you happen to be one of those snobby Greeks like Anna Komnena, the distinction between Roman and barbarian has disappeared. They have blended in. Wherever they settle, they formed a single nation. They're Frenchmen, or they're English, or even they are Italian, because I should say that after about 700 AD, the distinction between Lombards and Romans in Italy had become more a matter of name and known bloodlines than any visible difference. A question. During the Reconquest of the West, why did Justinian not make Belisarius the Western Emperor? Because Justinian didn't want a Western Emperor. He wanted to be the Emperor of a single Roman Empire. Indeed, when Belisarius was besieging Ravenna, the Goths eventually said, we will surrender Ravenna if you promise to become the emperor. And Belisarius said, yes, all right. And then as soon as the Goths surrendered the city, Belisarius said, I was only joking, I'm a loyal subject of Justinian. More fool him, I suppose. What the Goths were asking for was probably what the native Italians wanted as well. They wanted a strong man in Italy. They wanted a king, an emperor, you name it, but somebody they could look to as their defender against the various external enemies. They didn't really want to be an outlying dependency of Constantinople. That explains the decentralization of the empire in the later days of Justinian, where Italy and North Africa were transformed into what's called exarchates, where you have what amounts to a regent in both Ravenna and in Carthage, somebody who had total day-to-day control over the administration and the defence of the territory. It was always a balance in Constantinople. On the one hand, the locals do badly want and they need a local strongman. On the other hand, you don't want this man to be so strong that he can set himself up as emperor, which is something that happened in Italy in the 7th century. It also happened most notably in Carthage in 609, when the Exarch of Africa, he sent his son Heraclius off to become emperor. He started a rebellion against Phocas and sent his son and his nephew off to sort out the empire, to get rid of Phocas and restore decent government at the centre. Constantinople was always rather jealous of strong local leadership, but quite often it had to allow that because that was the only condition on which the locals would accept membership of the empire. Today we're going to talk about the Vandals in Africa, another group of barbarians who took over another part of the empire. You can see on this opening slide the various movements of the barbarians. There you have in green a set of movements which I only describe in the negative sense so far as it produced actions from other peoples. So I don't say much about the Huns in themselves, but the Huns move west, pushing everybody else west and south in front of them. They break across the Danube and they break across the Rhine. And I'm looking this week at the blue lines, the Vandals, who move out of what is now southern Poland and Silesia, Central Europe, into first of all southeastern Europe and then sharply west, coming across the Rhine and then going down through France, across the Pyrenees, into Spain, and then astonishingly across the Straits of Gibraltar all the way to Carthage, and from there fanning out to the islands and even to Rome. It is a surprising story, and it's a story of which we are maddeningly ignorant. We're ignorant of it because there is a lack of written sources. If you want to know what's going on in Italy with Theodoric, you have a mass of sources. You have church documents, you have the letters of Cassiodorus, you have a number of later histories and chronicles, you have extensive digressions in the works of Procopius. There is no reasonable shortage of materials for Ostrogothic Italy. Indeed, there are so many sources it's hard to keep control of them. We know what's going on in France. Not quite as well as we would like, but we have people like Geoffrey of Tours and a number of other writers. even in England, there is about a century of darkness in the 5th century. We're not quite sure of everything that happened in this country during the 5th century. It's not a totally dark age, but it's rather dim. We're not too sure about it. But when you come to the Vandals in Carthage, there is a severe lack of written materials, and we don't know much directly about it. And when it comes to archaeology, we don't know that much either. We don't know much because of various climatic changes. There is also the fact that when the Arabs invaded in the later 7th century, they wiped. No, let me withdraw that at once. They didn't wipe anything. The Arabs reset, that's it. They pressed the historical equivalent of a reset button, and what follows the Arab arrival in North Africa is the beginning of a new civilization with a new religion and a new language. And the reason they were able to press that reset button had nothing to do with their destructive nature. It was, I think, the progress of desertification, because when the Arabs carried on into Spain, they did not destroy the development of the Spanish language, and they certainly didn't destroy Spanish Christianity. They coexisted with it for 7 centuries until they were eventually expelled. But the Arabs, when they conquered North Africa, found themselves largely in possession of a completely new territory which they could shape as they would, which means that we don't have much in the way of prior history from the Arabs. As far as the archaeology is concerned, we are only just beginning to take a serious interest in the Vandal period. When the French and Italians ran North Africa, they were largely interested in the Roman period. Nobody was terribly interested in the Vandals. They had no successors. Even German nationalists, who would otherwise have taken some interest in the progress of their ethnic kinsmen, didn't pay much attention to what happened in North Africa. It's out of the way. It's no longer part of our civilization. It's not like Italy or France or Spain or England. It's part of our territory, and so we pay attention to it. It's outside our territory. Even when Europe reached out and took North Africa and ruled it, it was never quite the same comfortable interest as you would have in the Ostrogoths or the Lombards in Italy. And so what I'm saying is that we know a great deal less about the Vandal period in North Africa than we would like to know, but a number of surprising things do come out of a pressing of the very few documents that we have. Let me move first of all, there is another map showing the progress of the Vandals through Europe, but enough of that. Let's look at Africa. In the 3rd century BC, North Africa was dominated by Carthage, a Semitic power, and it was soon to be the greatest enemy of Rome. It was in no sense a territory that you could regard as part of Western civilization. But Carthage drifted into a series of catastrophic wars with Rome, each of which it lost, indeed each of which it lost worse than the previous one, until in 146 BC, Rome had finished its destruction of Carthage. It had absorbed the whole of what was once the Carthaginian Empire. It destroyed Carthage as a city and demolished it, leaving it for about 100 years as a set of ruins. Then in 49 BC, Carthage was refounded by Julius Caesar, a useful dumping ground for the poor and landless of Italy. And because Carthage has such a wonderful position on the coast of Africa, because it is such a very good port, it grew like a mushroom until within 150 years of Caesar's refounding, Carthage was a city with a population of maybe 500,000, and it was the second biggest city in the western part of the empire. But this new Carthage, founded by Julius Caesar, was not at all like the old Carthage. It was an entirely Latin-speaking city. And the other cities which grew up along the northern coast of Africa, and here is a map showing these cities: Cartena, Caesarea, Tipasa, Hippo Regius, Utica, and so on. These are all Latin-speaking cities. Latin, rather like Greek in Egypt and Syria, had a rather strange hold on North Africa. It was the language of law, it was the language of administration, it was the language of education, it was the language that everybody who wanted to be seen as a person of quality spoke and claimed to speak as a native language. And if you had taken yourself off to Carthage in about 150 AD, you would and you could have functioned entirely in Latin. But once you got outside the gates of those big cities, or sometimes once if you took yourself into certain districts in those cities, or sometimes if you listened to your Roman hosts when they were a little tipsy or when they didn't think you were listening, then you would hear some very different languages. Then you would hear Punic or Berber. You'd hear some of the pre-existing or the native languages of North Africa. And once you're outside of the cities and deep into the countryside, then Latin might not have been very well understood. So this was a Roman area, and it was an often rather densely Latinized area, but Latin was never the language of the majority of people, so far as we can tell. It may have been a language which was in some measure understandable by the majority in the coastal districts, but it was not always the native language. That being said, Africa was home to a very distinguished literary tradition in Latin, people like Apuleius, and of course the Christians, the African Christians, people like St. Cyprian or Tertullian, and of course St. Augustine. Africa had its own very distinguished branch of Latin literature. There is a conjectural aerial picture of Carthage as rebuilt by the Romans. Now, North Africa was an immensely wealthy area of the empire, and I think I'll need to move to one of the much later slides to explain this. We think of North Africa nowadays as an overwhelmingly dusty, fly-blown kind of place where the desert is an ever-present fact. But this does not appear to have been the case in the past. There is the Sahara Desert, which covers an area larger than the United States. It covers the whole north of Africa, except for a few rather lucky parts, the Nile Valley, for example, or the coastal regions on the north. But those coastal regions, the desert does stretch very, very close to the sea. And the reason for this is that until the end of the last ice age, this was one of the most favoured regions of the earth. This was one of the few places which had adequate rainfall and where a rather lush agriculture was possible, not that one existed at the time. However, about 8,000 years ago, the tilt of the Earth's orbit shifted slightly from 24.1 degrees towards the present 23.5 degrees. What this has done is it's a gradual shift. It's not a sudden movement of the Earth, it's just a slow drift over thousands of years. What it's done has been to make the entire north of Africa It's given it a great deal less rainfall than it had, and it's also rather hotter, but it's mostly the absence of rainfall. So during the past 8,000 years or so, the desert has been gradually encroaching over what was previously wet and very green territory. There were lakes all through this area, there were marshes, there were rivers, there were forests. It was rather like equatorial Africa, but as I said, a shift in the tilt of the earth has messed that up. The progress of the Sahara Desert has been a continuing fact throughout recorded history, and that is one of the reasons why the Roman ruins that you see in North Africa are generally in desert regions. This is, I think, Tim Gad, and let's look at that. Those are the ruins of Tim Gad, an enormous Roman city. It's in the middle of a desert at the moment. Indeed, it's spent about 1,500 years buried in sand. It was only dug out from the 1920s onwards. Whereas if you look at the bottom right-hand slide, this is a representation of how Tim Gad looked when it was a new city. If, like me, you spend a reasonable amount of time, perhaps more than you should, but a reasonable amount of time looking at photographs of the surface of Mars and wondering what it looked like 2 or 3 billion years ago when the planet was wetter, you'll recognize this kind of contrast. Many of these Roman cities in North Africa are to be found in territories which do look very like the surface of Mars. They're dry as a bone. But when those cities were built, they were in the middle of lush farming districts. So you have a very favourable climate in North Africa. By about 100 AD, Africa was producing about 1 million tonnes of grain a year. A quarter of it exported. It was a major producer and exporter of beans, figs, grapes, olive oil, marble, wine, timber, livestock, pottery. According to Josephus, Africa fed the city of Rome for 8 months of the year and Egypt for the other 4 months. So Africa is the richest province in the western part of the empire, and it may well have been the richest province. Africa is also the home of Western Christianity, or the birthplace of Western Christianity. Although Christianity spread throughout the whole empire, in the West, it seems to have put down much earlier and deeper roots in Africa than it did in Gaul or Italy. Indeed, for about a century, there was a stiff competition between Rome and Carthage for the chief city of Western Christianity. St. Cyprian, a bishop of Carthage, he was the first Christian bishop anywhere to be martyred in 258, and I've mentioned some of the prominent African Christian writers, Tertullian, Cyprian, Augustine. Africa was also the place of some rather gangsterish disputes between rival denominations. Just before Constantine established Christianity, there was the last great persecution, the persecution ordered by Diocletian. There was, as soon as the persecution finished, an immediate dispute between those Christians who had handed over their religious writings for burning and who had made the required sacrifice to the emperor, and those who had refused to do so. Those who had conformed and those who had refused to conform. In North Africa, this led to a long-running semi-civil war within the province. It shows the level of enthusiasm. A question about the difference between St. Augustine of Hippo and St. Augustine of Canterbury. Let's look at the dates first of all. St. Augustine of Hippo, the great church father from Africa, he died in 430 AD. St. Augustine, the evangelizer of the English, he arrived here in 597. So there is a difference of dates between them. But St. Augustine was a North African from a good family who converted to Christianity when he was an adult. He lived most of his life in an empire which had so far not been invaded by barbarians. Towards the end of his life, yes, there had been barbarian invasions. Indeed, he died in his see of Hippo while it was being besieged by the Vandals. But St. Augustine lived within an entirely Roman world, whereas St. Augustine, the one who came to Kent, he was a Roman, not a barbarian, but he lived long after the demise of the Western Roman Empire. They were different people. Let's have a look at the Vandals. Look at that map on this slide. Those green areas to the east, that's where we first come across the Vandals. Tracing the origins and movements of these peoples is always difficult, and I know nothing about it directly. I simply rely on what I've found in the standard textbooks. But the Vandals first come to our knowledge in southern Poland, the Ukraine, Silesia, around that kind of area. They then are pushed west and south by the Huns, and then in 406 they are in position to be one of the peoples who push across the Rhine in the west, straight into the territory of Gaul. I should mention something of this Arian dispute, which keeps coming up. The Christians within the empire were largely Catholic or Orthodox. There was no particular difference at the time except in terms of language, Greek or Latin. The barbarians are said to have been Arian heretics. This comes from a dispute which blew up after about 312. It was after Constantine established Christianity. It is a dispute which strikes most of us as entirely worthless. You can hardly be bothered to explore it. But the question arose whether Christ is identical to God. Is Christ simply another manifestation of God, or was Christ a person created by God? It doesn't strike us, I think, as a very important dispute, but it was at the time of enormous importance. I think one of the reasons why it was so important at the time was that if mainstream Christianity, if the mainstream church had accepted that Christ was a creature of God, there was the possibility that the pagans would simply embrace Christianity, saying, oh, so it's just another cult. Christ, he is also a manifestation of the one true God, along with Jupiter, Apollo, and all the others. So yes, we'll go into church, and we'll also go to the Temple of Isis and the Temple of Apollo. And so Christianity would simply be absorbed into later paganism, whereas the Christian church had a different idea. There is no salvation except through the church. Apollo, Jupiter, Isis, etc., those are at best demons whose worship must be beaten down. There is no possibility of a compromise between Christianity and paganism, and there is no possibility of assimilation. Arianism must have been seen by many Christians as a dangerous concession to paganism. And so within the empire, Arianism was suppressed, or it died out. Whereas for historical reasons, because the first missionaries across the river frontiers were Arians, or because the barbarians themselves rather liked the idea of a son who was subordinate to the father. It is a much easier way to look at things. For whatever reason, the barbarians, when they first came into the church, came in as heretics. They came in as Arians. This is a significant difference between the barbarians and the Christians within the empire. However, something that we must consider is that most indeed all of the histories of the religious relationships between the barbarians and the Romans. This entire branch of history was written by Catholic churchmen sometime after the event. Because these people thought that these religious differences were very important, their histories tend to play them up, whereas it could well be that on a practical day-to-day level, nobody thought much of them. Once you look away from the histories written by the professional theologians, you'll find that a Christian has usually been regarded by other Christians as a Christian. I'm not too sure about the significance of this difference, but it is a difference. The barbarians were generally Arians at first, and the citizens of the empire were usually Catholics or Orthodox. Gibbon makes a point that after so many persecutions and with the almost miraculous conversion of Constantine, you would expect that the Christians would settle down to practice the virtues of their founder. Instead, they spent several hundred years trying to investigate the nature of their founder, something which it is much harder to do than to practice what he preached. Comment from a class member that in a recent survey of Church of England communicants, something like 90% inadvertently confessed that they were of the Arian persuasion. I must admit I'm with Jessica there. Arianism is something that is much easier to understand. Christ was created by God as a messenger. He was sent down to earth. He was then taken up to heaven. And although he stands infinitely above us, he is still a creature of the Father. It's something that it is easy to comprehend, whereas when you look at the Nicene Creed in the Book of Common Prayer, it has an almost scandalous disregard of common sense about it. But I'll say no more than that. Let's have a look at the progress of the Vandals, and oh dear, yes, we must press on with this. The Vandals move through France because they can't find anywhere to settle down. The Ostrogoths, well, they've got Italy, and the Franks, they've got France, and the Angles and Saxons, they've got England. Wherever the Vandals go, they find that somebody else is settled there before them. They have to move out of northern France because that's run by the Franks. They have to move out of southern France across the Pyrenees because southern France is run by the Burgundians. They get into Spain and they find that the Visigoths are settled there, and there is still a continuing Roman administration with some rather large armies to throw against them. You've got this series of unpleasant defeats. 409 with the Alans, another bunch of vagrant barbarians. They cross the Pyrenees into Spain. 417, the Visigoths inflict terrible defeats on the Vandals and Alans. 422, the Roman authorities defeat the Vandals, and so, well, 422, they do establish a foothold around the coastal regions of southern Spain, and they build a fleet and they take to piracy, as one does, because there was nothing else to do. But then in 428, Gunderic, their king, was killed in battle, and he was succeeded by his half-brother, Gaiseric, who was the son of a Vandal king, but his mother was a slave woman. So he's not the most obvious of people to take over, but he takes over as the king of the Vandals and Alans, and from that moment things look up for the Vandals. They look up because Gaiseric is, together with Theodoric and Clovis, the greatest of all the barbarian leaders. He takes the Vandals and he transforms them from a minor and a vagrant nation of barbarians to the major naval power in the Mediterranean. Gaiseric's big break came in 429. Boniface, the governor of Africa in Carthage here, is in revolt against the imperial authorities in Ravenna. He feels the need of a bit more military support than he easily has, so he thinks, I'll bring some barbarians into Africa. They'll do very nicely. He brings 80,000 Vandals and Alans across the Straits of Gibraltar, a very large number of barbarians, and they bring themselves in their own ships, which should perhaps have rung a few alarm bells at the time. Boniface soon realises that these people are not perhaps quite what he expected. He tries to get rid of them, but they say, no, we're here now. And so in 430, question, where did these 80,000 barbarians find their ships? They built them. They settled down in southern Spain, and because there was nothing else much to do, they built a small pirate fleet and began to raid the islands in the western Mediterranean. Most barbarians didn't easily take to the sea, though the Goths did in the 3rd century when they sailed down through the Black Sea and into the Aegean, but the Vandals, they took to water very happily. And, well, they got themselves across to North Africa and they conquered it. In 430, they take Hippo, which is the 2nd biggest city in the province. That's where St. Augustine is the bishop. He dies during the siege, maybe of stress, though he was 75 at the time, which was a very fine age for somebody in those days. In 435, the authorities in Ravenna, they recognise that Gaiseric is the king of the western part of North Africa, and so they accept that, and Gaiseric guarantees that he will not move any further east, and Carthage is safe. But, well, Gaiseric was never one to be bound by the wording of a treaty, so in 439 he marches east and he takes Carthage. He walks into the city, which is completely undefended, and most of the inhabitants apparently are in the theatre when the barbarians walk in. He simply takes over. He takes total control of Roman North Africa, and he rounds this off by conquering Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, Malta, and all the small islands in the western Mediterranean, because he is not simply the leader of a considerable land army, he also has a considerable navy at his disposal. Now, here I must mention the Pirenne thesis. Has anyone come across this? Henri Pirenne, a great Belgian historian. One of the beliefs until the early to middle 20th century was that the barbarians had come across the river frontiers in unstoppable floods and had put an end to ancient civilization, at least in the West. Pirenne looked at the literary evidence and at what amounted in his time to the archaeological evidence, and he came to a different view of things, which is that the barbarians did nothing to disrupt the fundamentals of ancient civilization. In the cultural and economic sense, the barbarians left almost no footprint. And he spends a lot of time arguing that, except in England, if you look at France and Italy, where the barbarians invaded, you see almost no footprint in the languages. Very few, about 200 words in French can be identified as having come into the language from the Frankish barbarians. And so the barbarians rapidly assimilated into the existing societies of Roman Western Europe. And society, culture, and the economy continued pretty well as before. For Pirenne, the great break was not the barbarian invasions of the 5th century, but the Islamic invasions of the 7th century. That is when the historical clock was reset. And I think there is a lot to be said for that view, only my personal inclination would be to say that the clock was not reset by the Islamic invasions, but by those extreme climatic events of the middle 6th century. But what matters at the moment is that it is increasingly accepted that the barbarian invasions did not seriously disrupt the pattern of ancient life, particularly of ancient cultural and economic life. And this seems to have been the case in North Africa. And here we come to the difficulty, which is a lack of material. We have two main sources. There is Procopius, the legal secretary to Belisarius, who wrote the definitive or the only history of the reconquest of Africa and Italy. He discusses the Vandals in, I think, Book 3. There's also Victorinus of Vita, who was a bishop, a Catholic bishop. These two men, they are our only direct literary sources for Vandal rule in North Africa, and they are both hostile to the Vandals. Procopius, because he is the legal secretary to the man who brought their kingdom to an end, and Victorinus, because, well, he is a Catholic bishop, and he doesn't like the Vandals because they were Arians. And so both talk about the taking and burning of cities, and about a terrible persecution of the Catholic majority in North Africa. So it looks as though the Vandal occupation of North Africa was very unlike the Ostrogothic occupation of Italy or the Frankish occupation of France. The Vandals came in as a hostile elite, and that is how they remained until the Byzantine Greeks stepped in the 530s and saved the Romanized inhabitants of North Africa from further oppression. That is the official story that you get from Procopius and from Victorinus. However, when you press those sources, and when you look at the very small number of other sources that are available, what you see is once again an immediate and almost seamless merger between the barbarians and the native Romans. Let's call them native Romans. It's easier to say than the existing population of North Africa. There is an almost seamless merger between them. For example, how did Gaiseric build and maintain a large fleet which was able to dominate the Western Mediterranean? It could well be that the barbarians, that his own people, all 80,000 of them, had seawater in their veins, but it is more reasonable to suppose that Gaiseric used natives of Spain and North Africa who were more accustomed to naval matters. I'm not talking about mercenaries. When the Arabs laid siege to Constantinople in 717, they used Egyptian rowers for their navy, and because the Egyptians were Christians, they defected to the Byzantines. When you use mercenaries, there is a limit to what you can do with them, whereas Gaiseric appears to have had total control over his navies, which indicates that he probably had their complete loyalty. And since these people were probably Roman natives, what you can see is a degree of cooperation. There is also a piece of late evidence. When Belisarius was invading North Africa in the 530s, the Greeks were not always welcomed as liberators. There were continual guerrilla attacks launched against the Greek invaders by the peasant farmers. And also on one occasion, Belisarius had to get hold of a Roman nobleman, Laurus, and impale him in public because large numbers of the Roman landowning class was perfectly happy to side with the Vandals. You also have the fact that there was a significant degree of intermarriage between the Vandal and the Roman elites. There is no evidence that the Vandals continued using barbarian clothing. Indeed, barbarian clothing, thick woolen cloaks, cloaks, furs, the sort of things that you wear in Central and Northern Europe because it's rather chilly there. It just isn't terribly appropriate in North Africa, is it? So there's no reason why the Vandals should have kept up their ancient clothing habits. There's also zero evidence of the Vandal language in any inscriptions or in any of the admittedly limited literary evidence from North Africa. It seems that they switched almost immediately from Vandal, and we're not even sure what Vandal was. We've got a few words in it. It was a German language, these were Germans, but we don't know much about the Vandal language in itself because they dropped it at once in favour of Latin. And there is a further matter. This is from Procopius, the great historian of the age. And he's talking about one of the last effective Roman emperors, Majorinus, known to us, I think, as Majorian, who was the emperor between 456 and 461 when he died of dysentery. There is a story, which is probably apocryphal, it doesn't matter. The point is that Majorian is trying to make a treaty with Gaiseric, and he decides to go in person to discuss things with Gaiseric to see what's going on in Carthage. So he disguises himself. He doesn't want to go as the Roman emperor. He wants to go as the Roman emperor's ambassador. So he has to disguise himself. And look what Procopius says about his main difficulty. His hair, which was famous among all men as being so fair as to resemble pure gold, he anointed with some kind of dye which was especially invented for this purpose. So here you have a Roman emperor who is notoriously white blonde. Many of the Romans appear to have been identical in their appearance to the barbarians. The barbarians and the Romans had lived together for many centuries now, for 2 or 3 centuries. I keep on saying that those river frontiers, they're open frontiers with a great deal of movement backwards and forwards. There are many Romans who look like barbarians, and the barbarians themselves are increasingly Romanized in their clothing, in their religion, and in their language. And so there is no great barrier to any merger between them. The barbarians and the natives of the Western Roman Empire are increasingly identical in their appearance. And as I said, once the barbarians adopt Christianity, adopt Roman clothing, and adopt the use of the Latin language, then the only difference between them is one of names and of known bloodlines, but otherwise no particular difference. There's no reason why the Vandals and the Romans in North Africa should have remained separate from each other. And as I said, there is a lot of evidence of intermarriage. There is a lot of evidence that on the ground, although the theologians on both sides may well have ranted at each other about their differences, Arians and Catholics did not hate each other. A bit like Catholics and Protestants in modern England. There you are. I'm Church of England, you're a Catholic, fancy that. Discuss a few theological differences in a rather bored sense, but that's about it. You have more in common with each other than you have with people who are not Christians. Although the histories make a big fuss about these theological differences, I don't think that in practice they were that serious. There is every reason to suppose that Gaiseric was accepted as a legitimate ruler by the population of Roman North Africa, and he presided over a great apparent prosperity. And let me come back to what I said a few weeks ago. One of the great benefits to being ruled by a barbarian strongman is that he may collect fewer taxes than the unified Roman Empire ever did, and the taxes that he does collect will mostly be spent locally. When Gaiseric took over North Africa, suddenly all the taxes paid in North Africa were spent in North Africa. They were not taken off to Ravenna and then apportioned out for the defence of Hadrian's Wall in Britain or for the Rhine and Danube frontiers, matters which were of zero importance for most people living in places like Hippo and Carthage. The benefit of being ruled by a barbarian strongman like Clovis or Theodoric or Gaiseric was that the taxes were lower, and as I said, the taxes were spent locally on things that were relevant to the local taxpayers. We have every reason to suppose that Gaiseric was regarded as a legitimate ruler of his kingdom by his Roman subjects. The reasons we have to believe this are that he was the king for 40 years, and he doesn't seem to have faced a rebellion from his Roman subjects. His navy must have been predominantly staffed with Romans, and not only does it seem never to have mutinied, but it seems to have fought with inspired loyalty. The archaeological evidence we have suggests continuing great prosperity in North Africa during Vandal rule, and we also have the fact that Gaiseric is a uniformly successful ruler of North Africa. Why should he not have been regarded as a legitimate and indeed a popular ruler? And let's have a look. The economy. Now, we just don't know, because the archaeological evidence has not been dug up or it hasn't been sorted through, and the literary evidence is so lacking. But there's some evidence of large-scale pottery manufacture and export in the Vandal period. There is some evidence of lavish villa construction. There's a nice mosaic from the Vandals attacking Carthage around 500. Procopius claims that the Vandals fell so easily because of the great prosperity of Africa in the previous century and the luxury to which the Vandals had been exposed, which is not a claim you would make if you turned up in an economic dead zone. One of the few things you can't say about the ruling class in North Korea is that its vitality has been sapped by luxury and prosperity. The reason Procopius could get away with that claim was that the Africa that Belisarius invaded was still a very prosperous place. You then have the fact that the grain requisition no longer existed. It was no longer the case that a third or a quarter of the grain produced in Africa was effectively confiscated by the Roman tax authorities and shipped off to feed the population of Rome. Gaiseric resumed grain shipments in a treaty of 442, but it was for a price. Oh, and don't forget that Gaiseric's navy was partly a pirate navy, and that usually brings a degree of wealth to the base. Religion, hard to say. We're told that Gaiseric was a furious persecutor of the Catholics. It's just that most records of religious persecution show that these things carry on at hysterical pitch for generation after generation after generation. What that tends to indicate is that the persecutions have not carried on at furious pitch for generation after generation after generation. If I became the dictator of this country and I really wanted to shut down the Catholic Church, I could probably knock it on the head in about 18 months. Oh, it would go underground, it wouldn't disappear, but I wouldn't need to have continual purges and persecutions, because there wouldn't be any churches left to burn, or there wouldn't be any bishops left to arrest. Yet the story of Vandal persecutions, year after year after year, the Vandals are arresting and persecuting Catholic bishops. Well, as I said, eventually you do run out of Catholic bishops to kill, and you run out of Catholic churches to confiscate or to burn. So there is something suspicious about the evidence brought up by Victorinus of Witta. Oh, Gaiseric in Rome. Another important. Let's see what arises from this. In 455, Valentinian III, a grandson of Theodosius the Great, he's murdered. He's the last really legitimate Western Roman emperor. The usurper marries his sister Eudoxia and forces her daughter to marry his son. Maximus, I think the name of the usurper, a Roman name. Eudoxia, the sister of Valentinian III, appeals to Gaiseric for help and points out that one of her daughters has already been pledged to one of the sons of Gaiseric. Gaiseric transports a large army across to Italy. He marches on Rome. Maximus the usurper runs for it. Pope Leo I begs Gaiseric, please don't destroy Rome. And Gaiseric says, I wouldn't dream of destroying Rome. But instead he stays there for 14 days and goes about rather like the Venetians in Constantinople. He doesn't burn, he doesn't destroy, he doesn't murder. What he does is he strips the city of everything that's valuable and isn't nailed down. Everything made of gold or silver. He strips the gold and bronze tiles from the roof of the temple of Jupiter. He also takes the Ark of the Covenant, which was taken from Rome in AD 70 by the Emperor Titus. He strips Rome clean of all valuables, doesn't burn anything, doesn't demolish anything. He then takes the surviving imperial family back to Carthage, marries the emperor's niece to his son, as was already promised. He then sends the rest of the imperial family off to Constantinople, saying, you'll be much safer there and you'll be happy with your own people. Based on what Gaiseric did in his sack of Rome in 455, the Vandals have a rather bad reputation. But I think the important thing to bear in mind is that Gaiseric is there for the money. He's not there to destroy. He's there for a spot of plunder, and it's very effective plunder. Relations with the empire. Because Africa is so rich, and because it contributed, not contributes anymore, but because it contributed so much grain to the feeding of Rome and other West European cities, and because Gaiseric has conquered so much of the Western Mediterranean, and because he is in control of such a large and troublesome pirate fleet, both emperors in Ravenna and Constantinople view him as a considerable irritation. They want to reconquer North Africa. They want the Vandals out of Carthage. But it doesn't work. In 460, Majorian, the person I mentioned earlier with the white blonde hair, he collects a fleet in Spain to invade Africa. And Gaiseric simply launches a preemptive attack, burns the whole Roman fleet, and that's the end of matters. Majorian has no more money, so his attempted reconquest of North Africa is abortive. Then in 468, there's a coordinated attack on Gaiseric from both empires. The Eastern Empire sends out 1,113 ships and 100,000 men. They leave Constantinople. They land near to Tripoli, down here, quite a long way from Carthage. What Gaiseric does is he waits. He waits and waits and waits. And then, at the right moment, he attacks them with fire ships and he destroys the whole invading fleet. He chases the survivors back into the empire. He gets as far as the Peloponnese, and he's thinking of taking that bit over as well. It can join with Sicily in his island possessions, but the Byzantines or the Eastern Roman authorities won't let him take the Peloponnese. So he takes 500 of the leading citizens as prisoner, and while sailing back to Carthage, he gets sick of them, so he has them killed, chopped up into small bits and thrown overboard. He goes back to Carthage to celebrate his great victory. Eventually, the empire has no choice. It makes peace. In 476, there's a formal recognition of the Vandal kingdom from Constantinople. Gaiseric dies the following year. He is the legitimate king of Africa. He's been accepted from Constantinople. For the next 50 years, the Vandal kingdom in North Africa continues, prosperous and broadly rather tolerant in religious matters, as far as we can tell. And here are some coins of the Vandal kings of Africa. These are mostly, I believe, of Gaiseric himself. Here's a list of the successors of Gaiseric. And bear in mind that this is a half-century period. From the time when Gaiseric dies in 477 to the Byzantine Reconquest in 433, that's as far back as our joining of the European Community in 1973. And bearing in mind that people didn't live as long, it is more than a lifetime ago. The Vandal kingdom after Gaiseric is not something that lasts a couple of years and then falls apart, like the Ostrogothic kingdom after the death of Theodoric. This is an entirely viable concern for another half century. Then you have that change of policy in the east that I mentioned last week. I don't need to go over that again. Belisarius and Justinian. The Reconquest. The Reconquest goes very quickly. Belisarius lands 10 miles from Carthage. You have 3 battles, all of them lost by the Vandals. The entire Vandal kingdom is absorbed back into the empire. The Vandals, who have not blended into the existing population, are recruited into the Roman army or the Byzantine army, and they're sent as 5 regiments east to stiffen matters on the borders with Persia. And that is the end of the Vandal kingdom. It disappears totally from history, except for that photograph on the right of the slide. That's interesting, isn't it? A native girl from North Africa. It looks as though the Vandals did leave a footprint. The problem is that we know so little about them. And the reason we know so little about them is because a century, 150 years after the end of the Vandal kingdom, you have the end of Roman rule in North Africa. Most importantly, you have the expansion of the Sahara Desert, which destroys North Africa as an agricultural superpower. It means that the cities empty out, and it's the cities where the Latin-speaking population lived and the cities where the Christians live. When North Africa recovers, it is as an Arab Islamic region, not because the Arabs persecuted or murdered the Romanized Christians. The church in North Africa died out. It became extinct. There was, I believe, there were small scattered communities as late as around 1600 in North Africa, where a kind of Romance language was still spoken, but that became extinct a long time ago. The Romance languages that are nowadays spoken in North Africa are Italian and French, and that is because of 19th and early 20th century colonialist expansions. So that is the end of the Vandals in North Africa. And what can I say? So far, I've looked at the Ostrogoths in Italy, I've looked at the Vandals in North Africa, and what I've shown is considerable success while these kingdoms lasted, but then total destruction. followed by a new beginning. But as we pass on, we do need to start looking at those barbarian kingdoms established after the break, established after that great breaking point in the middle of the 6th century, those climatic events. But there are barbarian kingdoms established within the territory of the empire, the Lombards, and of course the Angles and Saxons and the Franks, who historically were a great deal more successful and therefore are a great deal more interesting. But the Ostrogoths and the Vandals remain very interesting, a very interesting early merger of Roman and barbarian, which should put you on the alert if anyone talks about the violent and destructive nature of the barbarian invasions. They were invasions, and they were often violent, and the barbarians, not always the people you would gladly invite home for Sunday lunch, but it wasn't always a matter of raping and burning and pillaging. There was another side to it.